Today, I wanted to welcome Lucie Mattera, who is the Secretary General of ChargeUp Europe, an organization that works in Brussels and across Europe to ensure a seamless driver experience for EV drivers. And first, I wanted to say welcome, Lucie.
Thanks. Hi, everybody.
Really a pleasure to have you here today. I'm here with my co-host as well, as usual, Mike Hawks. Mike, how are we doing?
Very well, thank you. Looking forward to today.
And maybe we could start with Lucie. You can tell us a little bit of the background of ChargeUp Europe and your background as well.
Yeah, sure. So ChargeUp is a trade association, right? So we represent the interests of the EV charging industry, so hardware producers, CPOs, MSPs. And indeed, it's a very young organization. It was created 3 years ago. And on the back of that strong growth, basically ChargeUp had to create, its own secretariat. And this is how I came on board in September last year.
ChargeUp Europe each year publishes a state of the industry report that looks at the electric vehicle charging industry. So the 2023 report, much like the 2022 report, demonstrated clearly that the gross EV adoption throughout Europe continues to grow and increase even in its pace. But we know that it's not uniform across Europe. I wanted to ask you whether you envision or see anything slowing this progress down. We know that some countries are now retiring incentive and programs. And what can countries kind of do and continue to modify their policies going forward to continue to facilitate electric vehicle adoption?
Yeah, let's start with the charging infrastructure in terms of what could slow us down, and then we can talk a little bit about EVs. So for our sector, it's a fairly long list, but if I had to pick and choose, grid connection and permitting, basically the number one bottleneck that CPOs are facing today. All right. So if you want to get your grid connection, let's say in Poland, it can take up to 3 years, which of course is not, optimal in terms of getting to the market. You still need to free up land. Some countries have adopted master plan to do that, land allocation, but that's not necessarily a best practice that is generalized across the EU. On the issue of EV penetration. So first of all, you don't necessarily need massive uptake of EVs to have a market on the side of EV charging infrastructure. Our projection from previous research of ChargeUp Europe is you need to have penetration of 7% of EVs in the overall fleet in Europe to have organic market activity on the side of EV charging. Another thing we're keeping an eye on is global barriers or trade barriers. We're seeing more and more the EU going in the direction of, I want to call it protectionism. And what that could do is slow down the imports of Chinese vehicles into Europe. So we're not, discussing that's a good thing or a bad thing, but what that could do for our sector is basically lowering the utilization rate of the EV charging infrastructure industry.
Yeah, I think that protectionism is an interesting point. As I was reading just yesterday, the Stellantis CEO was not very happy with the French government this week because they're trying to woo Tesla to come and open up a factory there. And he feels like they're maybe getting preferential treatment. And there's a real resistance, I think, to a lot of these Chinese brands and models that are now coming in. The more options a consumer has, the lower prices that they have that would facilitate adoption. But also, how do you balance that with the concerns of, national champions of many of these auto manufacturers in these European countries, I think is quite interesting. And I'm fascinated to follow that going forward.
Yeah, and maybe you said also something that was quite interesting then, Lucie. There was one data point you mentioned there. You mentioned 7% of the fleet, essentially, to be able to encourage and develop essentially an organic market. Can you just unpack that and describe it in a little bit more detail for us? And I think in the context of what ChargeUp Europe is then trying to essentially do and encourage, trying to get the market up to 7% consistently across European countries? Or is it more about building frameworks and mechanisms that makes that growth rate sustainable?
You need framework when you're trying to stimulate deployment in early stage markets. Basically, that's where it's useful, right? When you don't have enough market activity to sort of drive the rollout of physical infrastructure. So you want to have that sort of push coming from the policy side or the regulatory side. But once you have reached a certain stage, first of all, you can't rely on public support forever, right? No sector is ever going to have that, and that's fine. And at some point, and we believe the point is 7%, could be a little bit lower, could be 5, somewhere between 5 and 7. Then you just have enough EVs for your infrastructure to be profitable. Okay, so what we've tried to do when we talk to EU regulators is, okay, just help us a little bit at the beginning. You try to stimulate the early stage market so that they sort of catch up with the North and the West in Europe. And then we'll be happy to, take it from here once you have enough EVs in the overall EU fleet.
Fantastic. Thank you. And 5 to 7% is sales share or literal fleet and stock that's on the roads?
Stock.
Right. Yes, exactly. So a lot of countries now, they're not there yet. It takes quite a long time. And I think maybe related to some of the regional differences that we're starting to see, I think as Kevin's already alluded to in Scandinavia, definitely the early adopting and some of the regions that are most mature, perhaps then looking down to Southern Europe, and every country is taking its own type of mechanism and approach to promote public charging. Related to either, could you comment a little bit on some of the rationale or kind of reasons you've seen between why there are differences between perhaps Northern, Southern Europe or other individual regions, or maybe also some of the strategies you've seen to be very successful that could also help to inspire some of those countries that are a little bit further behind, need a little bit more stimulation to hit that sweet spot of 5 to 7%.
No, sure. You have a legacy factor, right? You have some other countries that have just looked at the e-mobility transition a little bit earlier than in the rest of Europe. And so they just simply started rolling out their program earlier. Then you'll have a set of local circumstances that will help or not help. The Netherlands just happens to be a very densely populated country, which means that when you deploy your charging infrastructure, you can make them profitable a little bit more quickly, which will in turn encourage the uptake of EVs and then in turn encourage the rollout of charging infrastructure. There's a role for political ownership, in a country like the Czech Republic, Czechia, where the car manufacturing is basically 10% of the GDP, right? You do have some concern that the e-mobility transition is going to lead to a lot of job destruction, and therefore we have seen the support to the e-mobility transition hasn't been unwavering. And then you also have market factors, right? If you take the price dimension, with an EV, you can charge at night. That can be, very competitive for you if the right tariff is in place, right? So if you take Europe today, you have around 140 dynamic tariffs that are available across Europe, but they're all kind of concentrated in 9 countries, right? Which happen to be the countries in the north, not so much in the south. And so all that opportunity for EV drivers to make very substantial savings, which then will improve the TCO of the EV, which will in turn encourage EV uptake. They're not available to everybody in the EU. Right.
I think I was watching some of the proposals and debates live. The speakers will come up and share essentially a point of view within that market. And one of the things that was mentioned was, as Europe, as a collective, to remain competitive, we're only really as strong as the countries that are starting to adopt and grow those EVs right now. And so we have to try to focus on supporting that transition. And as you've mentioned, it's definitely not as simple as someone just purchasing an EV. It affects many other different parts of that individual country. How do you at ChargeUp Europe consider those differences in how you're developing policies now? And is it possible to create a system that is perhaps more tailored towards those markets that are a little bit earlier on the adoption chain?
So what we're trying to do, when we can, we identify best practices, and we also try to speak about the economic opportunities that come with the e-mobility transition. It's not just the technical factors or just the economic side that are sort of influencing EV uptake. In some countries, there's genuine fear, right, of the sort of potential impact on the job market that the e-transition will have. So one of the things we're trying to do is to really sort of build up the evidence base, the data points around the economic opportunities that are linked to the e-mobility transition, and share that with the countries that are a little bit more reluctant. It's also, it's a question of creating the right framework, but also creating the trust to move along the transition that we're all trying to build, and making sure that you don't have a single narrative that is dominating the policy debate. It shouldn't be a narrative that's just about jobs that will be lost, but also about the jobs that will be created. And we're trying to document that in a way that is compelling enough for different governments to get on board with the mobility transition.
And what a challenge to do. Even though it is now a mainstream market, it's something which is massive globally and recognized globally. It is also changing very quickly, not just the technology, but then also availability. And I think that's one of the topics we wanted to go into a little bit later.
So, Lucie, I think we've up to this point have talked a little bit about the wide variation amongst different European markets. And one of the metrics that we look at, and I know you surely look at up to this point, has been number of charging points in a given country. And you say, wow, there's so many in the Netherlands. There's so many in Germany. There's so many in France. I think they account for, is it 40, 50% of like all publicly available charging points in Europe? And they would say, what's going on in Spain or Italy? And you say, you're not installing enough infrastructure. But in the latest report, you talk about the shift away from number of charging points and instead charging capacity. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and actually how this installed capacity is a much more crucial and important metric that countries and policymakers should be paying attention to?
The question of what's the right metric to use when you're trying to measure the deployment of physical infrastructure across Europe it's quite important, right? And as you said in the past, policymakers were quite focused on the number of charging points. That doesn't really correctly capture, the different needs of the different segments, right? If you have a charging station close by, well, good for you if you're an EV driver, but let's say you're an e-taxi driver. Every minute that you're not on the road driving a client around, you're losing money. So just having a charging station is not good enough for you, right? You need the power that comes with that. Same for the e-truck driver, right? You want to be able to charge your truck during your 44, 45 regulatory minute break. And so again, just the location of that station, that's a plus, but it's just not good enough in terms of, encouraging the full electrification of different segments that has to, happen over the coming years, right? So it's one of the points we've been pushing with EU policymakers, and they've actually accepted that for the AFIR regulation that will come into force next year, that the target or the metric that you want to be using is installed capacity, because that's what's going to measure your ability as a sector to transition a much broader range of vehicles.
The mention of heavy trucking and that destination charging is interesting because we know that charging an electric vehicle is evolving so much differently than just filling a vehicle up with petrol. So whereas that's pretty much the same right now for a personal driver and a heavy truck driver. But we know that destination charging is crucial for the trucks. It is crucial for long distance travel. And then for your everyday driver, your everyday needs in a city, it's going to be some combination of residential charging, workplace charging, and then the occasional top up at a public station. We know in the Netherlands that Shell is converting formerly petrol stations into now destination charging hubs. But your colleague, Aaron Fishbone, who we spoke with a few months ago, talked about how we actually need to retire the petrol station analogy because it's not relevant for electric vehicles. And we need to think about it totally differently and the different types of opportunities that having an electric vehicle opens up. So how do you kind of envision this going forward?
So we absolutely do need to retire the refueling analogy. That just doesn't work, right? What's refueling? I mean, in terms of business, you extract, you refine, you distribute. This is just not the word of EV charging. EV charging is what you integrate transport and energy via digitals. Those are, fundamentally different business models. One of the things we're trying to explain to policymakers, there is no such thing as the recharging experience, right? And it's one of the misconceptions we are encountering quite frequently. So, there will be a diversity of charging need, a diversity of charging location, a diversity of charging services supporting those needs. You will have some giant charging hubs, in the vicinity of cities, and you will also have individual slow charging at home. So it's just a range of solutions. So you're never going to have that one size fits all, and we just need to explain to policymakers that they just have to live with the diversity as we do.
Completely agree. You said right at the start, one of the biggest challenges is the permitting process. We've talked about that a fair few times, basically, on the podcast. And for those listening, it was a conversation we were having with Aaron Fishbone, who's also part of ChargeUp Europe, getting into understanding the real challenge behind that. So if you want to understand more about it, maybe reference back to that. But thinking about it with more granular analysis also makes us a little bit more realistic, being able to address problems and challenges like that. Are we really being realistic about what charge points need to be set up in the public setting and how much investment is required for them for individual EV drivers? I mean, potentially, right? There's always different arguments for different sides. But I think the challenge with permitting is that they're being flooded by all of these requests for lots of different charge points in different locations, trying to create this one size fits all, whereas actually they can be very clearly prioritized based on those transportation routes and analysis.
So Mike and I, we work in the expansion team here at Monta. So we kind of have a unique view into the way that this is progressing and developing market by market. You see some where utilities are heavily involved in a country. There you see other countries, markets where there's a publicly available charge point operators. They're big. They have thousands of charge points and they're the primary players in a market. Then you see these kind of solution providers that sit in between that cover that workplace and the home setting and everything. So one of ChargeUp Europe's values is this open market model. Some countries live up to this value, others do not. So how do you promote and facilitate that across the European markets?
Well, it's not particularly easy if we're being completely transparent. What we always try to do is to emphasize what is the choice that you're making as a policymaker. Is that going to benefit the EV driver? Is that going to sort of drive the best offer, or is that not going to do precisely that? Competition will help in driving a better offer for the EV driver. And that's sort of really, really basic economics, but sometimes we struggle to make this point. We're also trying to promote high-level principles to sort of help authorities develop their own framework, encourage an open market, encourage access for new players, fair competition, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what's going to give you, a broader range of options and ultimately possibly, lower price for the EV drivers. If that gets too bad, it comes a point when it becomes a competition issue, right? And that's, you have tools to address that under EU competition law. But mostly what we're trying to do is really promote a user-centric approach and ask authorities to start from the perspective of the user. So if you have a specific restriction in place, fine, but ask yourself, does that specific restriction serve the needs of the EV driver or not? And if the answer is not, then remove that restriction.
I really like that. I think Portugal is a good example of a market which I think is perhaps taking the interoperability discussion in a bit of a different direction, because they are setting up a system that is definitely with the EV driver in mind to try to protect them for the purpose of having a fair and unified price, having a consistent experience wherever you are charging. We've talked about the best practice approach, which I definitely agree with. Competition will basically support a growing market and I think also protect the consumer and ultimately start with the EV driver. Can you share some kind of best practice or maybe methods that you've seen in local authorities policy, which has really led to something like that, and projects that you've seen implemented in that way?
Well, it's hard to identify already.
You got to pick your favorite country. Pick your favorite. No. Who's doing it well? What's a good model country that you think is really promoting this openness and competitiveness?
The Netherlands was doing okay at the beginning. They sort of very strongly in competition. And over the past few years, they sort of taken a step away from that, unfortunately. France is doing kind of okay, not so much from the point of view of competition, more from the point of view of coordination. So they're trying to align, sort of freeing up land, having your connection, already sort of there when you're trying to install your charging station. And so you can deploy quite easily, but they're not particularly good at competition. It's just more coordinated. Let's call it work in progress across Europe.
Nice. Cool. Thanks. Let's keep going down the regulation discussion. And something that's definitely on the edge of our mind, because we've been trying to track it quite closely with yourself and also with Aaron, is the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation. I know it's something that's being hotly debated currently. There was an announcement, I believe, in the end of March that there was general consensus around what would be inside that regulation. Now it's going through the final steps of approval. And different to the previous AFIR that was released. So the directive is kind of boundaries and essentially kind of guidance, and regulation is then targets that countries will need to meet. But I think one of the challenges that could come up, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this, is how do you actually regulate that? How do you actually make sure a country is meeting those targets? And what are the consequences, if any, if those targets are missed? How do we actually support countries that might be falling short of it?
I'm going to try to answer that question and not bore you to death with details of EU policy.
We love this stuff.
Right.
Spice it up.
All right, so here it comes. Enforcement. So you have a range of mechanisms that have been foreseen by EU policymakers. So within the text, the AFIR regulation, you have a mechanism that sort of establishes a dialogue between national governments and the Commission. Okay, so as you said, there are targets that have been set up. And then basically what AFIR is doing is asking member states to develop national plans to meet those targets, right? So they're coming up with a draft, and the Commission will have a look at the draft, and they will say, yeah, that looks fine. Or, you know what, that doesn't quite look fine. Maybe you want to refine that a little bit, right? And here's some recommendations on how you would want to improve your draft, and then you have the final draft. Okay, so there's sort of continued dialogue, and you're seeing that in other sectors, and it's supposed to improve basically the quality of the national plan to meet the target. That's one.
Okay, so that's kind of mechanism one is you're designing the regulation essentially already with the buy-in of the individual countries. So they know it's realistic, and they're also building the process alongside it to meet that.
Something like that. It's also, making sure that the member states take responsibility for reaching their targets. They would design themselves the means to reach those targets, but they do have to design them. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. Now, failing that, because it's a regulation, what it's going to do is that it's going to give the European Commission the tools to drag national governments who are not meeting their targets to court. Okay, and so that's something called infringement procedure. It's a bit heavy and politically a little bit costly. So the Commission is using that mechanism not too frequently. However, they can do that, and that can result in a fine at the end of a fairly long process. this might be completely unnecessary, right? We are looking at the targets that have been set in the text, and we have commissioned some projection from an independent research outfit. And we were seeing that basically the target in terms of installed capacity, the EU average, we are already meeting those targets today, right, in the EU, and we will vastly outperform those targets by the end of the decade as an EU average, right, on installed capacity. Now you have other targets that are distance-based, so that's where, we could see some discrepancy. And also you want to make sure that it's not meeting those targets just as an EU average, but each country has to meet them, okay? Those targets aren't overly ambitious. So in terms of, enforcement mechanism, that may just not be necessary.
I'm just envisioning someone with a tape measure going out in like southern France and like going along the road and like, okay, we're now 50 kilometers away. Well, what's the capacity at this station? And then if it doesn't meet it, he like reports it and he notes it down and says like, all right,
it's actually 55.
They're missing 3 kilowatt hours at this station and reporting it back. I'm trying to think like what happens to countries that don't comply with GDPR or something. That's a big regulation. I'm thinking like Meta, they didn't release threads in the EU right now this week, and because they couldn't comply with the regulation here. So regulations really are binding. It's just in this industry with so many moving pieces, so many difficult ways to measure all the capacity and everything. It's going to be interesting to see how this regulation is enforced.
Yes. And I think building on that as well, one of the regulations, AFIR talking about installed capacity, but I think it's also pretty widely understood that once this all is in the ground, alongside electrification of other different industries, the actual final consumption of energy is going to massively increase over the course of the next decade, but also all the way up to 2050 and beyond. But also the grid, which is one of the oldest pieces of infrastructure that we have. And it's very costly and very difficult, basically, to simply upgrade other than trying to create more storage facilities, etc. So there was a stat that we're talking about 20% of the total consumption now is electricity, and that could increase somewhere between 37 and 50% by 2050. And that puts a big strain on the grid. But could you share your thoughts on some of the, concerns that people are voicing about how EVs and electrification of other industries would put that grid at risk?
It's a very common misconception that our sector is going to hugely strain the grid. That's just not the case when we have projections and they're showing a very, very different picture. So the demand from EV today in Europe, you're looking at approximately 14 terawatt-hour. Right? And that's projected to rise to over 140 terawatt-hour by the end of the decade. But in terms of what is the share, right, that this represents in the overall total electricity demand in the EU, that's 4%. It's actually quite small. In terms of do we want to be regulating the charging process itself, I think it's more a question of do we want to be harnessing it, right, considering the contribution it can bring to energy management system. One of our partners, Smarten, they looked at what our sector can bring right to the grid rather than what the grid can bring to us. They've done some simulation as smart charging that could actually provide over 100 terawatt-hour in a year, bidirectional charging that could provide another 21 terawatt-hour of upward flexibility and close to 24 terawatt-hour of downward flexibility, again, by the end of the decade. And then smart and bidirectional charging could actually amount to up to 10 billion euros of direct financial benefits per year for consumers by the end of the decade. Now, how do you make that happen? I mean, that depends on the range of factors. Some are technological, some are regulatory. And so the question, how do you have an electricity market design that sort of incentivize flexibility and demand-side response? And of course, how do you reward that flexibility? The framework is being modernized, reformed as we speak, and we should be landing on a final text in the second half of the year.
Fantastic. Final text on demand-side response.
It's broader than that. It's electricity market design, and demand-side response is part of it, but not. We think it's too small. So we're trying to make it a bigger aspect in the design.
Okay, don't let Kevin be a part of that because he might just try to encourage the use of tape measures to be able to measure 60-kilometer differences in install capacity.
I'll go out there. I'll measure, make sure these countries are staying in line. I think that's a great point, Lucie. A lot of these concerns regarding the grid oftentimes neglect to take into account going the other direction. They're worried about the strain on the grid, but they forget or they don't realize that there's going to be so much potential power and electricity going back into the grid. There's so many more opportunities and so much more power generation that's going to take place.
I was also going to say, but I think coming back to maybe one of your earlier points, and Lucie, did you say kind of 4% of the total electricity consumption?
Total demand. Total demand of
demand, 4%. I think it's also fair to say, completely understand the EV contribution is a smaller part of the total. But also, if every industry took that point of view, are we giving the right consideration to how the collective input or the collective impact to the grid essentially is? So we're talking about, yes, electrification of transportation. That's one. Electrification of the home and things like heat pumps. That's another one that'll be a big kind of contributor to that. So I think it's also a fair argument to say we still need to recognize that there is an impact that the increase or the electrification of transport will have. And we still need to put in place some controls to be able to do that. But there needs to be an overall collective approach, perhaps coming more from the actual DSOs and the network operator and the transmission system operators themselves as well to be able to manage the collective. Do you think that's a fair observation?
No, absolutely. You have Europe's transition strategy relies on basically two pillars. One is carbon pricing, the other one is electrification. So you're trying to massively electrify large swaths of the economy. It can be transport, heating and cooling, industry, energy, etc., etc. And so we're one part of that, but we're only one part of that. We do know what is the gap in the investment that is needed right, by the end of the decade, because the Commission has that number. You're looking at 600 billion euros of investment that are needed in the grid by 2030. Right, so 85 million each year. Nobody had that money, let's be clear. Which is why we're trying to emphasize, if you really sort of maximize what you can do with flexibility and demand side response, maybe you don't need to spend all of that money, but it's there, right? I mean, the need for investment, grid upgrades, etc. It's quite massive. It's not something that we can solve within the e-mobility, sector. We try to draw political attention to that point. And I think we've been fairly successful in that. We're seeing much more political attention that is now being paid to this issue.
And wanted to just have maybe one kind of final discussion about regulation, trying to encourage a competitive environment so that there are various different organizations that ultimately generate a better experience for the EV driver and also create a fair price so that also charging your vehicle is affordable, essentially. And so when we think about fast charging stations, one of the big battles that we see at the moment is essentially this race and this sprint to be able to secure charging locations. Yes, it's all about areas that are driving the most traffic, that are going to drive the most profitability and awareness. And then also as part of that, the ability to upsell additional services on that site, whether it's your Costa Coffee, Starbucks, etc. So it's a very lucrative space that all of these individual operators essentially want to be going after. And as a result, that creates a lot of competition within that. But what we see is that scenario is also leading to some problems that do impact the driver. So, for example, in Denmark, one of the operators here called Clever won a big public site with public chargers. That site itself is actually leased by the state, and then Clever operate and own the infrastructure that's set up there. But anybody who's not a customer of Clever, you will be witness to a much higher price, insanely high in comparison. And a result then that encourages people to have to try to find alternative charging locations, even though it might be the most convenient. So is there any discussion that's ongoing about securing locations for charge points and then also things like associated pricing strategies? Is that also something ChargeUp Europe is considering?
So not within ChargeUp, but within AFIR, you have a horizontal provision that basically bars discrimination between customers. And of course, it would be, sort of fine line to walk between, what is discrimination and what is just price differentiation. So that's one element. Second element is really transparency and user information. How do you make sure that your price is structured in a way that the user understands what they're going to pay? A third element that they've been looking at is really market surveillance, right? So you have, within AFIR, you have several provisions, review clauses. And basically what the regulators is saying, well, we're keeping a close eyes on how, MSP price offers evolve, and we stand ready to take action if we are going to see something in the next coming years that we don't like. And the last one is really just, hardcore competition laws. You had a fairly far-ranging investigation from the competition of the Commission into the EV charging sector, and they released their result, I think it was 1 month ago, maybe 2 months ago. They didn't find developments on the ground that are leading them to take action from a competition point of view, but they did say, well, we're going to keep monitoring the situation, and they're monitoring in particular how, MSP pricing strategies are evolving across Europe.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you.
Lucie, one thing that caught my eye the other day was reading about Germany, and they had walked back a target they set in 2021 for the year of 2030 of having 1 million chargers. And they said that that target was now a little bit dated and that it, quote, doesn't reflect technological advances and shifting preferences and would risk public chargers being built that receive little use. This is largely due to the fact that many more people are charging at home than they anticipated. What are your thoughts on this development? And does it demonstrate maybe a misplaced emphasis on public charging and charging behavior that we're still kind of developing an understanding of?
Yeah, so Germany has been flip-flopping a little bit on the e-mobility transition lately. So it's always hard to, determine what is driving a U-turn. Generally speaking, it might not have been the best sort of approach to announce national target when you're having an EU policy framework that is coming your way. So maybe they sort of realize that and are regrouping a little bit and wondering how they can sort of make these things work together. As I explained a few minutes ago, like the number of charging points, that's not really the best metric, right? To sort of measure how you're doing with the deployment of your physical infrastructure. But three additional remarks. So we've seen, and that's part of the State of the Industry report, private charging will remain dominant in the coming years until by the end of the decade. We think by 2030, it's still 80% of the charging, right? So it's 80 or 4/5. So that's quite significant. And indeed, if you go too high on your deployment of public charging infrastructure, what you're going to end up with is a situation where you have an overbuild of infrastructure, and what that means that your utilization rate is going to be too low, and what it means that you're never going to be profitable, right? So it's a fine. You have to be a little bit smart in terms of how you're sort of moving forward with your targets. In terms of are we deploying enough, as I said, we've looked at the installed capacity targets that AFIR is putting in place. We've looked at, where we are in our deployment and what we are expecting to deploy over the coming years. And we are meeting those targets today, and we will, as I said, vastly outperform them by the end of the decade. There shouldn't be too much of a concern on this.
We're talking about the number of CPOs in Switzerland. They are talking about the right to charge or the lack thereof in Switzerland. And I was wondering, maybe we're 50 years ago, did they establish the right to petrol or something? Is that a God-given right or an EU-given right? I don't know. I'm American, so I come from a place where rights are very important, I guess, or at least more heavily emphasized. Mike, I'll turn over to you. R2C, right to charge.
Exactly. How's your R2C? Maybe it's an index. What's your R2C index within a certain country? That makes sense, actually.
All right. Yeah. There's those metrics that measure a country's human rights index. How are they? You could talk about countries charge rate index.
I don't know how quickly something like that would be adopted necessarily, but maybe it'll be an indicator when people purchase a car or not. But no, I think maybe related to the topic before, right? I read an interesting quote in the New York Times earlier today. It was, the problem isn't just about gas-fueled cars. It's in general our car-fueled lives. Maybe it's an R2T. It's a right to transport. It's a right to move yourself, or an ability to be able to generally move yourself from A to B.
You have a right to plug in some countries. So it's not quite. France has a right to plug. It's for people who live in multifamily buildings, and it's a little bit difficult, to ask for your. And you have to go through, the what's called tenant association, etc. If you want to have charging stations in your parking garage, and it can be a little bit difficult occasionally. And so France just introduced a right to plug. You want a charging station in your building, then you can have it. Voila. Done.
This is what came up in Switzerland last week as well, is that right doesn't actually exist in Switzerland for people to be able to ask for that demand. And so as a result, there's no incentive or willingness for housing associations or private organizations to invest and set that up on behalf of their employees.
If they're looking at it, they say, we have these tenants who might not be here in 6 months or a year. So that EV that was there, it might not be here in a year. So I don't want to invest in this thing that might not be utilized in a year. Now, again, they might not be at that 7% that you talked about, that organic need, but it's kind of a face-off. Same with commercial landlords, commercial tenants, right? What if we have charge points in our parking lot here in Copenhagen? I actually don't know who financed them. I don't know who paid for that. I assume we did.
We paid for the charge points. We pay for also the amperage allocation. So that's assigned to Monto as an organization. But if we were to move our offices, we have to basically cancel that and purchase a new one at the next location. So there's loads of.
If you come visit the Monto office, you can charge. You have a right to charge.
You have the right to plug at Monto.
Opportunity. Let's be more of that. You have the opportunity to charge. OTC. No, that's a different thing. over the counter.
Yeah. Maybe just then, I guess, a comment related to Germany. And I was reading one of the interviews that you did when you joined ChargeUp Europe, Lucie, which I thought was great, very kind of insightful, talking about trying to identify best practices and I think also pulling apart an actual method and to write the correct policy. And one of the things you'd mentioned, one of the keys to ensuring EV adoption is met is a real policy consistency and policy alignment, and then also having a very clear policy direction. But I think I also definitely empathize with policy writers because trying to create that in a very quickly moving and very quickly evolving industry is also quite challenging. And it's okay to try to change those targets at some point if it makes sense.
All right. I got to sorry, Lucie, I need to do a North America focused question. I know it's not your domain of expertise, but I just was curious for your thoughts regarding the standards war that has erupted in America now as we see car makers and then also charging companies, hardware manufacturers, adopting the North American charging standard in America. We know over here in Europe, it's the CCS, as by and large, it was won out. That's what the automakers are making vehicles that have that. And charge point manufacturers are building chargers that are CCS. What do you think about these kind of standards wars that's kind of over there? What do you kind of see anything like that developing here in Europe, or is that kind of settled debate and that's something for North America to deal with?
So for the moment, we're not seeing it as an immediate risk for Europe, basically just because of the regulatory framework we operate. I think it's more, sort of general term, high level principles. Hopefully you're seeing industry converging towards, the shared technical solution rather than a broad range of technical solutions that will fragment your market and sort of make the experience of the EV driver less smooth. So we're keeping an eye on it. As you said, for the moment, it's more a North America issue, but we're hoping that in Europe, we won't see too much of that sort of divergences in terms of technological solution that could sort of be deployed. One thing maybe to keep in mind, we're in the EV charging space, not in the OEM space, but if I were an OEM competing with Tesla, I think I would want to accelerate a little bit because Tesla is sort of rolling out those changes just through the sheer size of that market domination, right? There comes a point when you are no longer a market maker, just making the market yourself. And I think what that flags, there's a little bit more competition that is needed and that could be helpful.
It's this domino effect, isn't it? Tesla's kind of nudging its buddies nearby, General Motors, Ford. Come on, you want to go down this charge point route. And now every single manufacturer has to very much rush to update its production lines to be able to support this, and then also try to adapt legacy infrastructure to go for it. So, and then also the knock-on effect on operators who are out there. You have to have installers visit all of your sites, set up an adapter. Who pays for that? It's very complex. Tesla's designing that for themselves. I don't know if necessarily everyone's going to be very happy about it.
Have you heard anything from the hardware manufacturers that are members of ChargeUp Europe that also sell into the US? Are they having any difficulties there?
Some of them are already sort of adapting to sort of new market reality, but some have already made announcements, and some I think are probably considering making announcements. It's I think a developing situation. Let's put it that way.
All right, Lucie, we have a couple of finishing questions for you. If you could wave a magic wand to fix something in our EV charging industry, what would it be?
So it wouldn't be something to change the EV charging industry. It would be something to change the EV market. I would very much love to see EVs becoming a little bit more of a democratic product, which is not necessarily what they are today. So if we could have a broader range of car models and also more choice in the lower price segment, I think that would be quite useful. You don't want EVs to just stay as an elite product.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Price parity is a huge barrier, but also a hurdle that the industry needs to get over. And then I hope that we will see this tipping point again where it becomes much more mass market. And then one final one, Lucie. So throughout this whole podcast, we've talked about various policies, best practices, individual rights, maybe also to plug, which I think is very, very interesting about how they try to encourage then or give power back to individuals to try to incentivize private organizations to basically buy into this adoption as well. But we're also surrounded alongside facts by many different myths. So if you could dispel one of those myths about the EV charging industry, what would it be?
I think something I'm hearing a lot from your policymakers is you're not deploying fast. So that's something that I'm hearing quite a lot here in Brussels. That just doesn't quite match what I'm hearing from the members. I'm hearing, stories of it's difficult to recruit people. We're struggling to find the right skills. Everybody is working quite a lot. We're all trying to deploy very fast to get to the best locations and be profitable as soon as possible. I don't quite see any members of ChargeUp Europe or Etsy at the wheel. I see everybody's trying to sort of grab the best opportunities very, very quickly. So certainly that's one that I think is just not connected to any kind of commercial reality in the sector.
Is it a facet of how there are so many problems to try to solve for? It's very easy to point at something and say, this is a gap that hasn't been filled yet.
Yeah, if you want to have a good e-mobility transition, it has to come from the cars. It has to come from the EV charging sector. It's about moving, in unison. They have their own issues, supply chain, et cetera, competition from China, blah, blah, blah. But on our end, again, I'm not saying anyone in this industry that is not doing their best to deploy as soon as possible and as fast as possible. That's just not the reality of the life at work in any of the ChargeUp Europe members.
Do you ever turn it around on them and say, could you cut a little of this red tape for grid connections, and then maybe they would go up faster?
That's a whole work stream within ChargeUp Europe. How do we cut the red tape? And in China, it takes 3 days to get your permitting, and in Europe, as I said, up to 3 years. So there's probably a middle ground here, but I don't know if you want to be going the Chinese
3
way.
days.
But
3 months? Maybe 3 months is the middle ground?
But it has to be a multiple of 3.
There's probably room for improvement, right? If there's a country who can do it in 3 days, maybe in Europe we can sort of improve a little bit our processes too.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Right. Lucie, thank you so much. Thanks for a really great discussion. I've really, really enjoyed it, and hopefully you have as well.
Super. Thanks so much.
In Between Charges is a podcast from Monta, the charging software for all your EV needs. This podcast is produced by Rocio Fortuny, edited by Risto Dimitrov. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you want to keep up with the latest news about the show, follow Monta on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. Happy charging!